the crux of the argument here is recovery and its performance, right? When we are dialed in on making money and getting glory and winning medals and winning these events so that you can get more Instagram followers, you can get some more clout, like all of that about health goes out the window. This is the sport that is the most dialed about recovery because that is the entire sport. Basketball, football, baseball, these big name sports, like yes, recovery is ultimately important, but so many different things can happen with your team. There's so many different permutations, combinations of things that can happen. The stimulus changes all the time. The athlete's performance isn't always based off of their recovery. Whereas in CrossFit, a lot of it is. One thing I want to point out here is this article from the Barbell Spin, and it says CrossFit publishes a list of athletes who tested negative during out of competition drug testing. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's watch the video in question where a very prominent CrossFit coach named Ben Bergeron kind of denies that CrossFit athletes are using steroids, or at least to the amount that we think they are.
CrossFit Games athletes have healthy bodies. What most people do when they see those athletes is go, no way. You can't look like that Adonis. You can't look like that type of a fitness model without being unhealthy, without taking performance enhancing drugs. I've seen firsthand that you can. What these guys are doing is really new. It's been a decade and a half of people training this way, constantly varied function movements at high intensity. There's a magic to that. You know, when you train for bodybuilding, you create hypertrophy, muscle growth. When you train for endurance events, you develop your cardiovascular system, amongst other things. The really cool thing about what happens when you do resistance training at a high heart rate is you elicit a very powerful hormonal response. That coupled with taking lifts to failure gets you jacked. Not only is it like the bodybuilding thing of like, I'm going to create hypertrophy and then I'm going to cut and just like starve myself. This gets to that aesthetic in a healthy way. That's a healthy body.
I don't know if it's entirely a denial of steroid use, but basically what he's saying is like, you can't have that look with, most people say you can't have that look without using performance enhancing drugs. And he said he's seen firsthand that you can. And basically what that entails is that the people that he's coached, he believes are clean athletes. Now, what I want to do here is steelman his argument. As hard as that may seem for a lot of people in the comment section who've just already made up their minds that everyone is on drugs at all times, anyone that does anything spectacular has to be on drugs. I think it's important to take a little bit more of a nuanced approach, build Ben Bergeron's argument up here a little bit before I ultimately disagree. As you can see in the comment section here, I said, yeah, I'm going to have to disagree with this one. That one has like 114 likes and 6 replies. So I've made it very clear that I disagree, but I would like to build this argument up a little bit.
It's been a decade and a half of people.
Okay, so one of the first points he brings up is that there has been a decade and a half of this unique style of training. Now, the argument against that is probably that it's not that unique. Doing weight training at high intensities or, certain sports that require a certain fitness level while having some sort of resistance, that's been around for a long, long time. And the bodies that are created out of that, they're the proof of this. But something I can say is that it is a little bit of a magical thing that CrossFit created that is a little bit different than anything that's ever been done before. What they're essentially doing, like he said, are, movements that drive adaptation, but they're mixing them and continually doing them. So if you were to think about like a super ripped like football player or something, the sport itself, playing the sport is not going to drive adaptation like actually playing the sport of CrossFit will. So I went to Wadapalooza. Here's an example of this. I went to Wadapalooza. One of the workouts was like a bunch of snatches, a bunch of burpees, and then they did like 50 dumbbell bench presses. Right now, that's right there. That was how they compete. And while you're competing, you could be driving adaptation. And you got to see that these athletes do this day in and day out. Their entire sport is driving adaptation all the time. And the growth hormone release, the adaptation, the response that your body has is really amazing. It is something that is different, right? To have something that's so competitive and so, pointedly about winning and getting a good score, but also driving adaptation at the same time. That really hasn't been done before. So I can kind of get on board with that. But that also, guys, that could be argued against as well. There could be other sports that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head. If you guys have those sports in mind, please comment. Please let me know below. But again, we're just steel manning this argument before we eventually disagree.
You can't look like that Adonis. You can't look like that type of a fitness model without being unhealthy, without taking performance enhancing drugs. I've seen firsthand that you can.
This is very interesting because there was a recent video that just came out, and it was the Buttery Bros. It was actually a compilation of videos where they had bodybuilder, they had Kai Green go up against a bunch of different athletes. There's like Half Thor was there, 3 or 4 CrossFit athletes. And you saw Kai Green, like his training style was not a mixture at all. It wasn't even remotely near CrossFit. But there have been bodybuilders. Who's the guy with like the super golden era amazing body? You guys commented below, but his main thing I think he trained only 3, 4, maybe 5 times a week. And his training sessions were under an hour and they were very fast. Like he was getting that metabolic component. His heart rate was getting very high. I know you guys know who this is. I'm sorry, my name recollection isn't good, but there is a possibility to train like a CrossFitter, or at least mixing bodybuilding with that kind of zone 2 style. Like you're just kind of pushing the tempo as you go. That can bring you a lot of success. But that comparison of looking like Kai Green. And then I think Justin Medeiros is in that video, which, by the way, guys, if you see Justin Medeiros in that video, he doesn't look like that freaky. He doesn't look that crazy. Obviously he's very cut and very in shape, but to me, he kind of looks athletic. Now, there are some athletes, and I know you guys have some in mind, that do look a little bit more suspicious. They do look a little bit more like the bodybuilders. All I'm trying to say here is that when compared to bodybuilding, right? And when we look at aesthetics, and the only thing we look at when we say what CrossFitters do aesthetic wise is impossible, I'm not entirely sure that's true. Like, I don't know, maybe they, do look a little bit unnatural. But I think the main thing for me is what they do and how they recover. That is ultimately the crux of my argument against his point.
What these guys are doing is really new. It's been a decade.
So another thing he talks about is that this is new. And it is true. That's something that I brought up before. It is new, and it's definitely something to be recognized. Like we're finally starting to see the catch up to CrossFit. When I went to Wadapalooza, the amount of money, the amount of goods and exchanges and competitiveness, it's palpable now. And now it's a thing that's here. It's a methodology that's here, and the results are being shown. Now, if anything, that is an argument against Ben Bergeron, the fact that this is such a solid sport and there's a lot of money to be made. That means performance needs to be really, really high for a lot of these athletes. And there's nothing that gets your performance higher quite like performance enhancing drugs. So now let's build our argument against Mr. Bergeron.
CrossFit Games athletes have healthy bodies.
This may or may not be true, but we don't really know how to equate that. I mean, we can say they have very fit bodies, very capable bodies, but ultimately, when it comes to sports performance, and this is a widely known thing, health is not what anyone is concerned about. I just did an interview with Matt Fraser. You guys should check out that podcast. It was a really, really great podcast. But if anything, Matt's mental practices or the anxiety that he felt was not healthy, but he was able to weaponize that anxiety. And now if we think about performance and things like that, if we're looking at health and longevity, training like a elite CrossFitter is not going to bring you that. So already I kind of disagree with that. If we look at CrossFitters, and we're talking elite CrossFitters here, I don't necessarily agree that they have quote unquote healthy bodies. They definitely could. But we would need more information. We would need blood work. We would need just daily practices. Some CrossFitters I'm sure are very healthy. If I wanted to get someone healthy, I would never tell them to go kill themselves in training.
What most people do when they see those athletes is go, no way. You can't look like that Adonis. You can't look like that type of a fitness model without being unhealthy, without taking performance enhancing drugs.
All right. So you can't look like that without being unhealthy, without taking performance enhancing drugs. So his argument is that CrossFitters are healthy and people who take performance enhancing drugs are unhealthy, which doesn't make much sense to me. I don't think health has any factor at all here. People online, people on the internet, people around the world, we look at performance enhancing drugs and we're not considering health. We're talking about performance. These are two different things. Like they shouldn't even be talked together. However, now that I think about it, a lot of times performance enhancing drugs can help with health. They help you recover so you don't get injured. They help you with injury prevention. So, ultimately, I think he needs to get away from this health aspect.
I've seen firsthand that you can. What these guys are doing is really...
Okay, so he also says, I've seen firsthand that you can. Well, maybe the athletes that he coaches, all of them are clean and he believes that or he knows that. But again, I don't really know how he could know this entirely. I'll talk more about the drugs that I would say that most CrossFitters, if they were going to take something, would take. But this is one of those things, guys, like you think you can know someone, you think you know what they do, but behind the scenes, you have absolutely no idea.
It's been a decade and a half of people training this way, constantly varied function movements at high intensity. There's a magic to that. When you train for bodybuilding,
Again, I like that point. Like this is different and we have to give that credence, right? We can't just say that like CrossFit style, elite CrossFit style training has ever been done before, at least in front of our own eyes. It hasn't. And we're looking at the result, but that doesn't necessarily say that performance enhancing drugs are not used. I kind of like that point, and I think a lot of people are going to hate it. I think a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this, but there definitely is a quote unquote magic to it. I'm not entirely sure I want to romanticize it like Ben Bergeron does, but I don't necessarily disagree with that point.
You create hypertrophy, muscle growth. When you train for endurance events, you develop your cardiovascular system, amongst other things. The really cool thing about what happens when you do resistance training at a high heart rate is you elicit a very powerful hormonal response. That coupled with taking lifts to failure gets you jacked. Not only is it like the bodybuilding thing of like, I'm going to create hypertrophy and then I'm going to cut and just like starve myself. This gets to that aesthetic in a healthy way. That's a healthy body.
Look, I think maybe in comparison to bodybuilding, CrossFit can get you to look a certain way in a healthier manner. I think that a lot of bodybuilders are unhealthy and they're probably more unhealthy than CrossFitters. The crux of the argument here is recovery and it's performance, right? When we are dialed in on making money and getting glory and winning medals and winning these events so that you can get more Instagram followers, you can get some more clout, like all of that about health goes out the window. If you ask a lot of athletes, like, would you take a decade off your life to win the Olympics? They would say yes. Okay. This is the level of craziness that we all feel. I mean, I think honestly, to a certain extent, you and I feel the same thing. Like, hey, Zach, would you take 5 years off your life to have 1 million followers right now on YouTube? I don't know. Maybe, probably not. I'm not a psycho like that. What if it was 1 year? What if it was 6 months, But you get to your deathbed and you're like, damn, I could use those 6 months right now to be with the people I love. Anyways, I digress. The point here is that, glory and money is such a motivating factor, and it is palpable now in CrossFit. A lot of these athletes are up top are making 6 figures. So the gear use has to be there. Now, I talked to Derek from More Plates, More Dates last night on the phone about this. And I said to him that it's probably less testosterone and compounds that we think they're using. Of course, they could potentially be doing that. This is not saying no to that. But I think a lot of what they are using or would use is peptides, EPO, and things like growth, things that are really going to move the needle as far as recovery goes. I think testosterone, a lot of compounds can help always with recovery. And it is difficult to catch someone who's been using low amounts of testosterone. You can also use test suspension. I think that these athletes are very nerdy around this stuff. Like, this is the sport that is the most dialed about recovery because that is the entire sport. Okay. Like, basketball, football, baseball, these big name sports, like, yes, recovery is ultimately important, but so many different things can happen with your team. There's so many different permutations, combinations of things that can happen. The stimulus changes all the time. But the athlete's performance isn't always based off of their recovery. Whereas in CrossFit, a lot of it is. A lot of it's based on what you did before and how you're able to do it again and repeat it and maybe do more, right? So these are the types of people that would benefit the most and I think would be the most likely to use PEDs. And I think people need to wake up to this. One thing I want to point out here is this article from the Barbell Spin, and it says CrossFit publishes a list of athletes who tested negative during out-of-competition drug testing. Today, CrossFit shared the list of athletes who taken and passed in out-of-competition drug tests in 2021 and 2022. In total, CrossFit conducted 18 out-of-competition drug tests in 2021 and 30 in 2022. 8 athletes were tested twice. And here are the 8 athletes that were tested twice. There's also a list here. What I can say is it's not enough. It's simply not enough. I've always said this. We can speculate. We can say that's impossible. We can say this. But if the rules say something and the only reason why someone would follow the rules is because of testing and because they can get caught, you need to do it a lot. You need to test a lot because my hands are tied. I can't tell you who's on and who's off. The only thing that can tell you definitively or relatively definitively, like to a high percentage, is testing. I'm not saying that anti-doping is perfect in the Olympics. Obviously not. I've covered anti-doping and the issues with anti-doping and doping and the issues with doping constantly. But what I can say is, like, this is simply not enough. 30 tests with 150, 200 elite athletes. Like, that's just not enough. I remember just off the top of my head, Kendrick Ferris was tested 15 times in 1 year. That was by USADA alone. He did probably 4 international competitions and then other competitions as well. So he was getting tested over 1 time per month, on average over 1 time per month. And that's an American weightlifter in America, like a sport that we don't really care about that much. UFC tests a lot more than this. There are a lot of more things like that. Look, this conversation about like doping and anti-doping can go on for ages and ages. And it's like something that I really want to just discuss at length. But ultimately, we can only go off of the information that we are given. And the only information we're given is from testing. And there simply is not enough. So ultimately, I disagree with Ben Bergeron. I think that he doesn't quite know his athletes maybe like he thinks that he does. And I think that he definitely has a bias towards athletes because maybe he has seen successful natural athletes and can equate it to the rest of the field. That's all for today's video. I really want to know what you guys think in the comment section. Of course, you can always just say, they're all on drugs. This is a dumb take. That's your prerogative. But I would like to see some nuance and see if there are some things that I've missed. Thank you guys so much. I'll see you later.